There we
Good
go.
evening.
Good evening. Good to see everyone. Good. Even if I can't see everyone, it's good to know that you're here. And this evening, of course, which is the Erev Hanukkah, which is usually the Parsha of Parshat Vayeishev, which we have each year. We find the longest single successive story in all of Chumash, aside from Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, what I mean by that is that, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu's story extends from Sefer Shemot, Parshat Shemot, all the way through the Devarim, the very last words of the Torah. But when we talk about a story which is a continuous successive story, namely that one incident is followed by the next, which is then followed by the next, and each of them is in one way, shape, or form connected to the earlier chapter or to the earlier episode. This is the longest single consecutive story that we have in Chumash. The story of Yosef. And the story itself at the very beginning is not a flattering story. It's not flattering about Yosef. It's not flattering about the brothers. Yaakov himself is open to a great deal of criticism about creating, or at the very least enabling, the terrible, terrible actions of the brothers selling Yosef. Yosef himself displayed what appears to be arrogance, thus, so to speak, contributing in his own way to his own difficulties. Now, we are going to focus today, though, on one person. We're going to focus primarily upon Yehuda, because Yehuda is the person who appears of all the brothers to be the most egocentric of all of them. Reuven does his part to try to save Yosef. We don't hear much about what the other brothers say as individuals, but both Reuven and Yehuda stand out when Yosef is sent all the way to Shechem on the pretext of seeing how his brothers are doing 60, 70 miles away from Hebron. And of course, Chazal talk about this as well, that the Malbim says this may be one of the very few places where Bechira Chofshit, a complete freedom of action, was taken away. Some say that it was taken away later from Paro, but here the Malbim says that Yaakov's behavior and his actions are so difficult to understand that the only real explanation for it is that he was actually acting out the episode so that the Jewish people ultimately would end in Mitzrayim, because Yaakov knew the difficulties that existed between the brothers and Yosef. For Yaakov to send Yosef 60 miles or 70 miles north to Shechem in that area, pretty much by himself, to find out how the 11 brothers are doing, or the 10 brothers are doing, that in itself is strange. Why does Yosef have to go himself to take this really dangerous and treacherous trip all the way north just to see how his brothers are doing? And so we find this situation of Yosef seen from afar by his brothers. They now choose to plot against him. And we find, of course, Reuven decides that they should throw him in a pit. and save him. And the purpose, the Torah goes out of its way to say that the motivation of Ruvain basically was to save Yosef. But then we are now going to pick up our story in Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Kaf Chet, Kaf, actually, I'm sorry, Pasuk Chaf Gimel. Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Chaf Gimel. Vayi kasher ba Yosef el achav. As Yosef came to his brothers to approach them, what does the Torah tell us? Vayavshitu et Yosef et kutanto. They stripped him of the coat, which itself had become the catalyst for their extreme dislike of their brother. And ketonet tapasim asher alav, the coat of the striped coat. We call it the coat of many colors. There is a shita within Chazal that say it's a coat of many colors, but actually pasim are like stripes. Even in modern Hebrew, the term pasim are stripes, and even railroad tracks are called pasim because they look like straps. And then the Torah tells us, Vayeishev le'echol lechem. They throw him into the pit and they sit down to eat. And the Medrash says they sit down and they eat and they say it's time to bench, and they're going to eat and bench. And Rabbi Yehuda sees that they are intent upon killing him. And then Yehuda says to them, Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Chavav. Vayomer Yehuda el achav, and Yehuda said to his brothers, Ma betza ki naharog et achinu, v'chisinu et damo. Ma betza, what profit is there in killing our brother and then in hiding his blood, meaning to say, to covering up the very act of murder? He knew that they were actually plotting to kill Yosef. Now, he then said, but he used the term ma betza. It's interesting that Mitzuda David, when he talks about the word betza is, oftentimes we use the term betza as graft, but Mitzuda David, not on this pasuk, but when he talks about judges who acted inappropriately, he interprets the word betza as chemdat hamamon, desire, the illicit desire for material things, for money. And Rashi himself here says, ma betza, Rashi says mammon. Where's the profit motive here? You're going to kill him. It's good. You'll feel good for a while. But in the end, what's going to come from it? Certainly, Dad is going to be very, very, very sad, even if he doesn't find out who did it. So you have got nothing from it. So Yehuda says, ma betza. Where's the profit? Let's they saw the caravan of Yishmaelim coming, and we will not have killed him. And the brothers agreed. So then the Torah tells us, it uses a very unusual phrase, Vaya'avru anashim midyanim socharim, various merchants. The Yishmaelim were coming, but apparently before they can approach, along came a group of Midyanim, a caravan of these people. Now then the Torah uses what so often creates difficulty, a series of verbs with pronouns, no names. There are 11 people or 10 people who are there, aside from Yosef, and all we hear is Vayimshechu. They drew him up, Vaya'alu, and they took him up, and et Yosef min abor, Vayimkeru et Yosef, and they sold Yosef Vayishmaelim, and they sold him to the Yishmaelim for 20 coins of kesef, Vayaviu et Yosef Mitzrayim, and they, meaning apparently the Yishmaelim, brought Yosef to Mitzrayim. And then, of course, Reuven comes and he sees what was done. Reuven would not have been there, and he sees what his brothers had done. And he says, where will I go now? I'm the oldest who's here, and my brother is now sold. Who do you think will be held accountable? So we don't know who actually physically sold Yosef. we know this, that the impetus for the sale is Yehuda. And Yehuda's reasoning is, there's no point in killing somebody. You can accomplish exactly what you want to accomplish. Plus, there's profit involved if we sell them to the Yishmaelim, either directly or indirectly. We don't know who pulled them out of the pit. It could be that the Midyanim or the Midanim drew him out of the pit, but we don't know. It's just they. And but once one of my students asked, so why doesn't the Torah just tell us? The answer is, it actually does not matter whether you directly do it or whether you are the enabler who allows it to happen or who provokes it to happen. You are held accountable for this. And the brothers throughout our own history are held accountable. Now, Rashi, who normally stands up and tries to find a good word to say about each of our own heroes, the Shvatim or Yaakov, here says it's Mammon. It was purely a profit motive that Yosef, that Yehuda hatched. Now the question is, why did Yehuda say what he said? Was it because he really believed what he said and really wanted to be done with Yosef, sell him? You don't have to have the guilty conscience of killing him. Just sell him to an uncertain fate. Or could it be that he knew to whom he was speaking? An irate group of brothers, even if we accept certainly what Chazal say that they were a bet din and they felt he deserved to die. Nevertheless, he knew what his brother's motivation was, and so he used the ploy that he thought would convince them best not to kill him, but to at least sell him to a fate, however uncertain. Now let's take a look and see what Rabbi Yoshe Ber says about Yaakov's, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, what he says about Yehuda's mindset. In contrast to Yosef, who was born with an ethical nature, Yehuda's natural tendencies were negative and occasionally even destructive. Judah's conscience told him that the murder of a brother was something appalling. Yet the compromise that he proposed, the sale to the Yishmaelim, was both strange and cruel. Chazal severely criticized Yehuda's advice in the sharpest terms. Whoever praises Yehuda for saying, "What is the gain if we slay our brother?" is nothing but an abuser. That's what Chazal say in the Gemara and Sanhedrin. Now, we're going to examine from this point on Yehuda's personality. And we will see, I hope by the end of today's discussion, that Yehuda is the great Baal Tshuva in all of Tanakh. He is the great Baal Tshuva, and one of his descendants, the greatest of his descendants, David HaMelech, must also bear that title. It is no coincidence that Yehuda goes through a complete transformation in his life, going from a person totally self-absorbed. Sell them, ma betza, what profit can there be? He becomes then from there all the way to the conclusion of our story in Parshat Vayeishev, become the great moral savior of everyone. But at this point, he, and I would imagine we'd have to say the brothers, were not tzaddikim, but they were tzaddikim, shall we say, in training. It's a way that we need to see all of ourselves. We all know that people are not born tzaddikim. The greatest of the tzaddikim, even though I know there are many biographies or tributes that talk about Gedolim being, a big tzaddik from the time they were born. But most people, even most tzaddikim, become tzaddikim through a process, through an evolutionary process, which takes them from the normal self-absorption of children to the greatest of people, Now, let's we have to look at the end of this particular episode. The brothers sell Yosef, and they decide they're going to take the coat to their father. Notice where it says, now we can skip to Pasuk Lamed Bet, Perak Lamed Chet, Pasuk Lamed Bet. Vayishalchu et Ktonet HaPasim. They sent the Ktonet HaPasim, Vayaviu el Avihem. Now, these are two verbs here in Pasuk Lamed Bet. Which is it? Did they send the coat, Yosef's coat, or did they bring the coat themselves? Different people give different explanations of this. The one explanation is that the children of Leah actually gave the coat to the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, who were sort of secondary brothers in their eyes, and they brought the coat to Yaakov Avinu. But no matter how we look at it, the coat was brought to Yaakov Avinu, and then in front of the brothers, they came to Yaakov and said, Vayomru. When they finally came, and it was brought to Yosef, the Yaakov, it says, Zot matzanu. This is what we found. Hakerno. Please identify. It isn't even please. It probably is identify now. Hakatonet binchahi imlo. Is this the coat of your son or not? Notice how they phrase it. Is this the coat of our brother? No, your son. It's as if a police inspector came, having found this coat and having no personal ties to the parents of this child, and say, identify this, please. I doubt, quite frankly, that even the most callous of inspectors would actually say to Yaakov, identify this now. Is this your son's coat or not? And we're going to see that, of course, that phrase, hakerna, comes back to haunt them much later, because that brings us, and it almost brings us, Yaakov, please notice here very carefully, Yaakov Avinu, Torah tells us, he did recognize it, and the Torah says, vayakira, he recognized it. Now, the word it, he recognized it, is an important word here, because the word it means that it's a qualifying adjective. It means he recognized the coat. He didn't recognize anything else. He didn't recognize the plot. He didn't know anything. But from that, his assumption is that Toraf, Yosef had been killed. Vayakira. We're going to see that word, vayakir, is found again in just a few more psukim. And that brings us to one of the most mysterious elements of the story. All of a sudden, Yosef is sold to Mitzrayim. What does every reader want to know? What happened to him in Mitzrayim? We would have expected the plot to move onward with Yosef in Mitzrayim. But instead, we have one of the most, again, arcane selections in all of the Torah, which is the story of Yehuda and Tamar in Perak Lamed Chet. And then the Torah says, after Yosef is sold to Mitzrayim, and the Torah tells us that, at that time, our dubious hero here, he decides to depart from his brothers. And he went to now Adulam is, you can actually find Adulam in Eretz Israel now, and not too far from in this case not too far from Beit Shemesh, not very far from it. There is a place called Adulam, and this person became Chira, came from Adulam, city called Adulam, not a city but a village. And then Vayar Sham Yehuda Bat Ish Knani. He met a girl who was of a Canaanite, Ushmo Shua. The name of the father of this girl was Shua. Vayikacheha Vayavo Elel. He married her, and he cohabited with her. We don't know her name. And throughout this, we have no real idea. Vatar vateled bein, the Torah tells us that she had a boyfriend, a young child. Yehuda, of course, the child of both of them, and Yehuda called his son Er. And then she again conceived, and she called, and upon his birth, he called the second child Onan. And then the Torah tells us another strange thing. Vatosef od vateled bein. She continued to conceive. She bore another son. Vatikro et shemo Shelah. She called him Shelah. Now, why is it she called him Shelah? The third son is called Shelah. And then the Torah says, right in the same pasuk, and Yehuda was in the city of Keziv, which is very far north. The story itself here takes place in the center of Eretz Israel. These births of the three sons take place, and then the Torah says, let me tell you, he was in Keziv. Who cares where he was? The answer is, betcha she cared, but he wasn't there. We can speculate, and I believe that the Torah is once again creating a persona who is totally self-absorbed. He certainly could know when his wife was about to give birth, but he wasn't there. There's yet another problem. We don't even know her name. The Torah just tells us he married Bat Shua, the daughter of a person named Shua. Now, he then continues. We then continue with this, that Yehuda, along comes a young woman by the name of Tamar, who marries his oldest son. He dies. She then marries the brother. He dies. And Yehuda says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, Yehuda said, I don't want you, in other words, Yehuda says, wait, I don't want you to marry. Shavi almana beit avich. Sit here, be an almana, be in the state of being an almana, where you cannot marry anybody else until ad yigdal shelah, till my third child grows up, right? And he said, why? Ki amar pen yamut gam hu ke'achav, because he was afraid that he would die, the child. Vatelech Tamar Vayeishev beit aviyah. So she went, she listened. She waits years, and nothing happens. Batshua dies. That's the wife of Yehuda. We really don't know her name, but she's told here. She's called Batshua. Yet more evidence of Yehuda's uncaring attitude. The Torah doesn't even tell us. We know who his daughter-in-law is. We even know who his friend is, Chira. We don't know her name. We don't know even his wife's name. And so therefore, and now she dies. And the Torah tells us, Vayinachem Yehuda, very quickly, Yehuda got over it. Vayal, and he went to his sheep shearing, and on the way, he's told that Tamar knew that he was coming. So she, after this long period of time, goes out. She removes her mourning clothes, which she's had on all these years. And what does she do? She dresses as a harlot. And she entices him. Now, the story itself is almost not believable. Yehuda sees her. She's dressed as a harlot. That in itself, all right. You see someone, and of course his wife is not there, so people who have their own self-absorption, he thinks, all right, so I'll take advantage of the situation. He sees her, and then he sleeps with her. He pays her, or wanted to pay her. And we'll see how that plays itself out. But he wants to have a relationship, not a relationship, wrong. He wants to have relations. Once again, Yehuda his personality is such that he thinks only of Yehuda. First of all, the Torah, as opposed to Yaakov Avinu, Yaakov, the Torah tells us that Yaakov refused when Yosef was killed, or at least when he thought he was killed, he refused any attempts at comfort. Here, Batshua, the person to whom he'd been married for these many years, who bore him 3 sons, dies, and the next word is Vayinachem. Yeah, he got over it. And then he goes out, and the Torah tells us about when he sees a woman whom he presumes to be a harlot, he decides he wants to sleep with her. Now let's think about this. Perhaps the most beautiful of relationships, human relationships, is that of a husband and wife, of people completely devoted to each other, sharing their destiny. And the expression of that love and devotion comes out through physical means, but it's an expression of caring about the other. But what is the nature of a relationship between a harlot and the person with whom she sleeps? It is purely a business deal. It's purely a business deal. And so it's the opposite of the framework of a loving relationship. So once again, we see Yehuda is involved with himself and only for himself. Now, this story is going to carry itself through next week as well. But I want to conclude with a remarkable medrash, a truly remarkable medrash, which through a simple word usage portrays for us a great theological fact. The Medrash takes note of the fact that Yosef is sold to Mitzrayim, and then immediately, instead of finding out what he was doing in Mitzrayim, the story now reverts back to Yehuda. And here's what the Medrash Rabbah says. Medrash Rabbah, Perek Pehe, Siman Aleph. Vayehi ba'etahi, and it was at that time, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman began by saying, by quoting a pasuk, Ki anochi yadati et machshavot shvatim. I know the thoughts, the innermost thoughts of the of people. Shvatim ayu asukim b'mechirato. Shvatim here means the sons of or the brothers of Yosef. They were asukim. Here's the word asuk. Notice asuk is what we call beinani pa'ul. It's passive. Haya asukim. They were involved with the sale of Yosef. The Yosef haya asuk besako uvetanito. And Yosef at this time, at the time of the sale, was involved with his own plight, with his sackcloth and with his mourning. Ruvain haya asuk besako uvetanito. So it was with Ruvain. He was asuk. He was involved completely. He was overwhelmed, if you will, with this. The Yaakov haya asuk besako uvetanito. And Yaakov was overwhelmed with his own mourning. The Yehuda. But what was Yehuda involved with? Haya asuk likach loisha. Can you imagine this? The Medrash says everybody is sad except for one guy. Yehuda decides, I think it might be time to get married. And that is the intervening parak that we have here. Now, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but what was God doing after the sale, during the sale, and after the sale? What was God doing? The HaKadosh Baruch Hu haya osek borei oro shel melech HaMashiach. He was now plotting and planning the coming of the Mashiach, which would be much, much later. So as you can see here, what appeared to be everybody here was overwhelmed with sadness, except for two. Yehuda, who decides it's time to get married. HaKadosh Baruch Hu haya osek. Notice the word asuk is passive. Everybody in the story is passive because everything acts upon them. Yosef was acted upon. He wasn't active. And the brothers themselves were asukim. When one person says, I'm busy now, asani asuk, what does it mean? It means I'm not completely in control. So maybe asuk, I'll have to deal with this later, or please call me back later, whatever it may be. And everybody was, with the exception of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu haya osek. Notice with the moving of the letter, one letter, from the third letter of the word to the second letter of the word, everyone else is passive. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is active. It doesn't preach. The Medrash doesn't do anything except to tell us simply there is only one being who's totally in control. No one else is in control. HaKadosh Baruch Hu hayosek. Next week, we're going to see the story of Yehuda and Tamar is not concluded. We'll see the second half of that story, and we will then see the complete transformation of Yehuda from a self-absorbed individual who thought only of himself, whose wife seemed to be who didn't bother being there at the birth of his child, who said, "Ma betza kinaro getushinu," what profit is there for us? Over the course of next week, we will see the complete transformation of Yehuda from a completely self-absorbed, egotistic, and egoistic human being to the great Baal Tshuva of Tanakh. Okay, everyone, we'll see you next week. Amir Hashem. Have a wonderful Hanukkah. Next week we will. It is Hanukkah. We will meet again next week. Amir Hashem. Kol Tov. Good evening, everyone.
Happy Hanukkah and good Shabbos.
Happy Hanukkah and good Shabbos.